Welcome back to Photoshop Basics on Psdtuts Plus. I'm Martin Perhiniak. In this tutorial I will talk about histograms and how do they help us in our Photoshop workflow. First we need to understand what is a histogram. If you ever took a digital photograph with a digital camera, I'm sure you've seen a histogram on the back of the camera. Now this is a really clever way to represent all the tonal information stored on a photograph. On the left we have shadows, in the middle we have midtones, and on the right we have highlights. And the histogram shows the intensity of the particular tones in a photograph. So for example, here on the left, with an underexposed photograph, we have mainly information stored in the shadow area, nearly no midtones at all, and a bit of highlights on the sky. On the contrary, with an overexposed photograph, we have most of the tonal information stored in the highlights and midtone area, nearly no shadows at all, and a lot of highlights, which is represented by this one vertical black line here on the far right. Whenever you see something like this, that means you have clipped highlights or shadows. So with an overexposed image, I'm sure you will see clipped highlights, and with an underexposed photograph, you will see clipped or burnt out shadows. This is something that you don't want to use in your image editing, so you shouldn't use under or overexposed photographs. Let's see an example where it seems we have lots of highlights and lots of shadows, and there might be clipping in this image. We have a histogram panel. You can find it under the window menu and choose histogram. I usually change the options for the histogram panel from compact to expanded view from the panel options area, and I also change the channel to RGB instead using the colors option. Now if you have a closer look to this histogram for this photograph, you will see that most of the information are stored in the shadows and the highlights area. We have nearly no midtones at all, but what would you say if I ask, do we have clipped highlights and shadows in this image? If you said no, then you're right. It seems that we have clipped highlights and shadows, but actually there is a very slight empty space here on the left and on the right, which means we have no clipping, but we are very close to clipping. So now another question, can we adjust this image easily in Photoshop? Of course, the answer to this question is nearly always yes. So I go to Image, Adjustments, and I will choose Shadow Highlights, which is a very useful color or tonal adjustment. So I choose this option, and as you can see, even with the default options, it gives us a much better quality image. I zoom a little bit closer to it, and I show you if I set back the shadows to 0, we see the original image. And I would like to also see the histogram panel on the at the same time while I'm changing the shadow and highlights options. So I increase shadows, and you'll see that we only increase the brightness of the shadow areas. That is easy to see in the histogram panel as well. So only the shadows will move closer to the midtones because we are brightening them up, but the highlights are staying in place. Now if I want to darken the highlights, I can increase the amount of the highlights value, which will only change the highlights and won't affect the shadows. So shadow highlights is for separately increase the brightness of shadows and decrease the brightness of highlights, which is an excellent thing. And as you can see, we did a really good job on this image. This was before and this is after. You can always check before and after by clicking on the preview in these adjustment windows. But the only problem that we have, because we had a very strong contrast on the bright sky and the dark foreground, this mountain here, we have something like a halo around the edges. If you click on Show More Options in the Shadow Highlights window, here you can turn down the radius for the highlights to get rid of that halo effect. So now, before and after, we have a really nice photograph and a much better histogram. It's hard to tell which is the best histogram. Sometimes you might use a really strong contrast photographs. Sometimes you use a lower contrast photograph. The only thing that you should look out for is the clipping. Now I show you another example where I will increase contrast with another adjustment called levels. I go to Image, Adjustments, and I choose Levels. By the way, these are all color and tonal adjustments in Photoshop, and I will come back to these in another episode, and we will learn more about them, how to use them completely non-destructively as adjustment layers. But for now, I just simply choose Levels. And as you can see, we also see a histogram here. That's why it's really important to understand how histograms work, because most of the adjustments in Photoshop are based on histograms. With levels, you can easily reset the white and black point of your images, which means you can increase the contrast of your photographs, which is a really important thing. So if you move the white arrow under the histogram, you increase the brightness by resetting the white point. That actually means that everything to the right of this white point is turned to white, and all the other parts of the image will be brightened according to this move of the white point. And this works just the same on the left with the black point. If I increase that, I will clip some of the colors to completely black, these colors on the left, but at the same time I increase the contrast of the image. If I check before and after, you can see what I mean. Sometimes you need to sacrifice some colors to have more contrast in your image. And if you would like to see the clipping that you make when you move the black point or the white point up and down, you need to press and hold down the Alt or Option key while moving these black points or white points, and you can actually see something like a heat image which shows you where you introduce clipping to your photograph. So it works on the black point and also on the white point. And now that we know lots of things about color modes, bit depth and histograms, we can concentrate on working with layers. And that is going to be the next tutorial. I hope you enjoyed this episode and you will join me in the next one. Thanks a lot for your attention.